Mr. Speaker, Labor supports this bill to select committee, and we do so for several reasons. Thank you. We support this bill in second reading, and we will support it right the way through, Mr. Speaker, for several reasons. The first is that this reflects the outgrowth of a strong domestic asset holding position from this bank, and that is in line with the objectives that we have for a long time taken to ensure that the domestic banking system is robust. Sir, we are fortunate in New Zealand that we have a number of strong banking institutions, and Westpac is one of them. And as an outgrowth of previous regulations, sir, the domestic size of their book has grown to the point where it requires legislation to allow it to continue outside the previous limit. Mr. Speaker, that is one of the primary objectives of this bill. So it's important to ensure that Westpac New Zealand Limited does have a strong and stable New Zealand operation while enjoying the benefits of linking to its trans-Tasman parent, which has improved its access to capital. We note the success of the Reserve Bank's local incorporation policy. It's one element in securing the stability of the New Zealand banking sector, and it's critical that we retain sovereign oversight of our banking regulation. Mr. Speaker, there have been a number of previous debates in this House around the fact that we need to retain a full-service central bank. And there were times and days gone by when it was suggested in this House that in fact what we might end up doing is ceding to the Australian banking authorities effective control over the New Zealand banking system. There were calls from that from the major banks given their parentage. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad that the previous Labor government resisted that call and ensured that we had an effective full-service reserve bank with prudential supervision. And this bill is here in this House today in part because of the effectiveness of those rules, and it gives the public of New Zealand through this House the opportunity to ensure that the law is still working in the interests of all New Zealanders. And that is that there is sufficient oversight over the operations of New Zealand banks, including Westpac, to ensure that it is strong, stable and well managed. And I'm pleased to report that based on all the evidence that we've seen in terms of the hearings on this bill, there is no doubt that Westpac does meet those criteria, as do others. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of related concerns that we would be remiss not to mention in respect of the banking system and some of the major banks in particular. The first is that we have been through a shocking time with the global financial crisis. Now, while it is true that we have enjoyed some of the world's strongest banks in our region, and it's also true that they have been plain vanilla banking rather than indulging in a whole lot of derivatives which cost so much in the American market and were in large part behind the collapse of September 2008, nonetheless, sir, there has been a linkage between the influence of the financial system and some of the economic problems that we face today. Now, you can't blame a bank for making money, but it is the responsibility of policymakers to see how that's done. And the fact is that in New Zealand we've had a huge housing bubble. We have net international debt about 85% of our GDP. Now that is just about as high as some of the so-called pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. It's just about as high in terms of total international debt. Now the difference is, and you wouldn't have heard it from Mr. English's comments in question time today, that it's not public debt. It's about 90% private debt, and of that about $6 in every 10 is house mortgages that were extremely profitable for the banks and extremely bad for the New Zealand economy. And sir, it is now that the Labor Party is saying that much more needs to be done, Mr. Bridges, to ensure that we never have a repeat of that bubble. Mr. Bridges, there's no point complaining about things that occurred before you were at school.
So think about the future when you're old enough to have kids and you can worry about their future. Because what we care about is the future. We're not looking at the past. If this government had confidence in its own abilities, it wouldn't be complaining about former governments. It would have the strength and the courage to look forward. And that's what the Labour opposition is doing, looking forward to make sure that we don't have another housing bubble, that we have appropriate incentives in our banking system to ensure we meet several objectives, Mr. Speaker. The first is good prudential oversight of the banking system. And it was under the former Labour government, thank you to the current members, that was extended. That this bill follows from an aspect of that prudential regulation which is ensuring a sufficient book in the New Zealand domicile from the major trans-Tasman banks. Westpac's in the fortunate position, if you like, that its book's grown so far we have to have this legislation. That's a subset of that prudential supervision. Secondly, we have to have regard to the macroeconomic place of the banking and finance system in New Zealand. We know that they have contributed to a housing bubble. We know that we have to go through deleveraging. We also know that the drain from the New Zealand economy of the profits of the foreign-owned banking system means that we can almost never run a current account surplus. Even if we export a lot more milk and wool than we import computers and petrol, we still can't make a current account surplus because we've got the drain of several $billion a year of profits from the foreign-owned financial system being repatriated. Now, Mr. Speaker, people often ask, what is the difference between the New Zealand economy and the Australian one? And the biggest difference is not minerals. The biggest difference is that they are capital rich and we are capital poor. Now, the reason we're capital poor is several. Number one, we don't save enough. And two, we don't own enough of our own financial system. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's appropriate to note in passing this bill that New Zealand's going to need to take steady and determined steps over time, working with the market in a responsible way to ensure that a higher proportion of our financial system is New Zealand owned because New Zealanders need to own more of their own future. So, Mr. Speaker, that is another important objective of the way we interface with the banking sector. I want to raise one final issue, and it is in relation to the GFC. It's made a lot of things obvious that weren't so obvious before. One of those is the culture of excess that sometimes exists in the finance sector. And Mr. Speaker, we just want to put on note in a very polite way that we do not want to see that culture of excess return in the New Zealand finance sector. We're not going to name any particular companies, sir, but we do want to ensure that everybody in New Zealand is paying their fair share to get New Zealand through the rough economic waters that we're going through, that nobody misses out and nobody dodges paying their fair share, that the pain is spread evenly and the opportunities go evenly. So what we don't want to see, sir, is millionaire bankers drinking Veuve Clicquot from dawn to dusk while a lot of New Zealanders can't afford milk. That is not the kind of country that Kiwis believe in. Not the kind of country where we get a fair go for all, where we take care of each other, where everybody gets a chance. We want a country where everybody gets a chance, where everybody pays their fair share, and that applies to the finance sector as well. Summing up, Mr. Speaker, Labour supports this bill. We're going to support the bill right through to third reading. I think it's got the unanimous support of the House, or very close to it. Mr. Speaker, we do so because it reflects the appropriate prudential regulation of the New Zealand banking system. It reflects the fact that the previous Labour government fought to maintain a full-service reserve bank that gives New Zealand the ability to oversee its domestic financial system, and that the reason that we're here legislating for Westpac today, which we're happy to do, is because it reflects the fact that their domestic book has grown to the point where it's exceeded some of those guidelines and it needs explicit legislative endorsement, and there's no problem in principle with that. But we will retain vigilance. We will retain vigilance to ensure that prudential regulation is appropriate and tight. We will ensure that the macroeconomic settings are appropriate and that we avoid another bank-driven housing bubble, and we will maintain vigilance to avoid a culture of excess returning to the New Zealand financial system, but rather that we move progressively towards owning more of our own future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call to Euroflavel. A point of order. I'm sorry. Point of order. The Honourable Dr. Wayne Mapp.
Yes, point of order, Mr. Speaker. I wish to correct a figure I gave in question 8. I seek leave of the House, I should say, to correct a figure that I gave in relation to question 8 today.
Leave is sought for this purpose. Is there any objection? There is no objection. The Honourable Dr. Wayne Mapp.
Mr. Speaker, this afternoon I gave a figure of approximately 61,000. That was the result of adding 2 figures up in my head as I was standing. In fact, the correct figure should have been, based on information supplied by the RNZAF, $65,098.
All right. There's no comments. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, just appreciate the Minister's comments, and that's totally in line with standing orders that he's come to the House to update the House on that matter as soon as the information's come to him. Mr. Speaker, I just wish to clarify with the member, my recollection at question time is that he said that was the fuel cost only.
No, that's not a point of order.
And I just wish to clarify in respect of his statement whether the 65 reflects...
I'm standing. The member sought leave to make a personal explanation. He's made the personal explanation. That's the end of the matter. We don't go into further debate on it. I'm calling to Euroflavel.
Honourable as I am, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not one to sort of follow the